My name is Steve Morrison, and I'm the city planning consultant who turned a petty neighbor dispute into a $47,000 lesson about glass houses. It started when Greg called code enforcement on my shed. It ended when I discovered his illegal rental unit, an unpermitted pool house. I live in a quiet neighborhood in South Austin, Texas, where I've owned my house for 12 years. It's a modest 3-bedroom ranch on a half-acre lot, perfect for someone who works from home and values privacy. My neighbor Greg Patterson moved in next door 3 years ago with his wife Karen and their 2 teenage kids. At first we had a decent relationship. Typical neighborly small talk over the fence. Borrowed lawnmower occasionally. Nothing too friendly, but nothing hostile either. Greg worked in tech sales and Karen was a real estate agent. They made good money and weren't shy about showing it. Within 6 months of moving in, they started renovating their house extensively. New deck, expanded kitchen, finished basement, in-ground pool with a separate pool house. The construction was constant, trucks, noise, workers coming and going at all hours. As a city planning consultant who specializes in zoning compliance and permit review, I couldn't help but notice that some of Greg's projects seemed ambitious for the permits I remembered seeing posted. But I minded my own business. Good neighbors don't scrutinize each other's construction projects, and I had my own work to focus on. That philosophy worked fine until Greg decided to make my property his business. The trouble started with something completely stupid: street parking. Our neighborhood has narrow streets with no sidewalks, typical for older Austin developments. Most houses have driveways, but when you have guests or multiple cars, people park on the street. I work from home and have clients who occasionally visit for consultations. Sometimes they'd park in front of Greg's house because it was closer to my driveway entrance. Greg started leaving passive-aggressive notes on their windshields. "This space is reserved for residents of 1247 Oakwood Drive." The notes read, "Please park elsewhere." Which was ridiculous because street parking is public. No one owns the curb space in front of their house. I tried talking to Greg about it. "Hey, Greg, I noticed you've been leaving notes on my clients' cars," I said one Saturday morning as he was working in his yard. "Your clients need to learn some respect," he replied without looking up. "I live here. I shouldn't have to park 3 houses down because your visitors are too lazy to find proper parking." "It's a public street, Greg. Anyone can park there legally." "Maybe legally, but it's not neighborly. A decent person would tell their guests to park in front of their own house." I explained that my driveway was angled in a way that made it difficult for visitors to park there without blocking my mailbox or the neighbors on the other side. Greg's response was to start parking his own cars strategically to block the spots where my clients usually parked. It was petty and annoying, but not worth escalating. I told my clients to park a little further down the street and forgot about it. But Greg wasn't done being petty. 2 months after the parking nonsense, I came home from a client meeting to find a code enforcement officer measuring my backyard storage shed. "Excuse me," I called out, walking over to the fence. "Can I help you with something?" The officer, a middle-aged woman named Susan Martinez, looked up from her measuring tape. Are you the property owner? Yes, I'm Steve Morrison. I'm here about a complaint regarding an illegal structure. Someone reported that your shed violates setback requirements. I looked at my shed, a basic 10x12 wooden structure I'd built 5 years ago to store lawn equipment and tools. It was positioned 8 feet from my rear property line, well within the required setbacks for accessory structures. Do you have the building permit for this structure? Susan asked. It didn't require a permit. Structures under 120 square feet don't need permits if they meet setback requirements. Susan nodded and continued measuring. You're right about the permit requirements and your setbacks look fine. This appears to be a frivolous complaint. Who reported it? Susan hesitated. We don't usually reveal complainant information, but since this appears to be unfounded, it was your neighbor at 1247 Oakwood Drive. Greg's house. I wasn't surprised. He claimed your shed was within 3 feet of the property line and required a permit you didn't obtain. Susan finished her measurements and filled out her report. No violations found. The structure is compliant with all relevant codes. After she left, I walked over to Greg's house and knocked on the door. Steve, he said with fake friendliness when he opened the door. How's it going? Cut the crap, Greg. Why did you call code enforcement on my shed? His expression changed. I don't know what you're talking about. You reported my shed as an illegal structure. The officer just left. Greg shrugged. If you build illegal structures, you shouldn't be surprised when someone notices. It's not illegal. It's been there for 5 years and it meets all code requirements. Well, I guess that's for the city to decide. They did decide. No violations found. Greg's face reddened. Maybe they didn't look hard enough. That's when I realized this wasn't just about parking. Greg was systematically trying to make my life difficult, hoping I'd either move away or become so frustrated that I'd stop having clients visit my house. Greg, I don't know what your problem is, but this harassment needs to stop. Harassment? I'm just being a concerned citizen, making sure my neighborhood maintains proper standards. By filing false complaints. I didn't file any false complaints. If your structures happen to be legal, then I guess you have nothing to worry about. He closed the door in my face. That night I decided to do some research of my own. If Greg wanted to play the code enforcement game, I'd show him how it's really played. As a city planning consultant, I have access to the city's permit database, zoning records, and inspection reports. I also know exactly what to look for when reviewing property compliance. I started with Greg's address, 1247 Oakwood Drive. The first thing I pulled up was his permit history. Over the past 3 years, Greg had pulled permits for several projects. Kitchen renovation, $25,000 permit fee. Deck addition, $800 permit fee. Pool installation, $1,200 permit fee. But as I reviewed the approved plans versus satellite imagery of his actual property, I noticed some discrepancies. The deck permit showed a 12x16 structure attached to the rear of the house, but the satellite images showed what appeared to be a much larger deck, extending at least 20 feet from the house and wrapping around the side. The pool permit showed a standard rectangular in-ground pool, but the images showed not just a pool but also a separate structure that wasn't mentioned in any permit application. I decided to take a closer look. The next morning I took a walk around the neighborhood with my phone, casually photographing properties for a neighborhood character study I claimed to be working on for a client. When I got to Greg's house, I took several photos from the street and the adjacent properties where I could see into his backyard. What I discovered was fascinating. Greg's property had at least 4 significant code violations. Violation #1. Unpermitted deck extension. The permit showed a 192 square foot deck. The actual deck was approximately 400 square feet, more than doubling the approved size. Under Austin code, any addition over 20% of the permitted size requires a new permit and inspection. Violation #2. Unpermitted pool house. Greg had built a separate structure next to his pool that wasn't mentioned in any permit application. It appeared to be about 150 square feet with electricity and plumbing connections. Any accessory structure over 120 square feet requires a permit, and any structure with utilities requires electrical and plumbing permits. Violation #3. Illegal rental unit. The pool house appeared to be set up as a living space with a separate entrance, windows configured like a studio apartment, and its own electrical meter. Converting any space to a rental unit requires special permits and inspections, plus compliance with multifamily zoning requirements. Violation #4. Setback violations. The pool house was positioned approximately 3 feet from the rear property line. Accessory structures require a minimum 5-foot setback from property lines. But the most interesting discovery was what I found when I cross-referenced Greg's address with short-term rental listings. Greg was advertising his private pool house studio on Airbnb for $120 per night. The listing showed interior photos of a fully furnished studio apartment with kitchenette, bathroom, and separate entrance. The description boasted about the newly constructed private retreat and resort-style pool access. Greg wasn't just violating building codes. He was operating an illegal commercial business in a residential zone. I spent the next week documenting everything systematically. I reviewed all permit records for Greg's property, zoning requirements for our neighborhood, short-term rental regulations, building code requirements for accessory structures, tax records showing assessed improvements. What I found painted a picture of systematic code violations that had been ongoing for years. Greg had been operating his Airbnb rental for 8 months without any of the required permits. In Austin, short-term rentals require a Type 2 short-term rental license, $285 annually. Fire safety inspection, compliance with parking requirements, 2 spaces per rental unit, compliance with occupancy limits, registration with the city's STR program. Greg had none of these. He was also advertising amenities that violated other codes. Professional-grade hot tub, no electrical permit for 240V installation. Outdoor kitchen with gas grill, no plumbing or gas permits. Private parking for 4 cars. His driveway was only approved for 2 vehicles. The tax implications were also interesting. Greg was collecting rental income that should have triggered a reassessment of his property taxes. Commercial use of residential property typically increases assessed value significantly, but Greg was reporting his property as a single-family residence while operating a commercial rental business. I also discovered that several of Greg's Airbnb guests had left reviews mentioning noise complaints from neighbors and issues with the cramped studio space, suggesting occupancy violations. One review mentioned that the bathroom ceiling leaked during rain, indicating potential plumbing code violations. Another mentioned that the electrical outlets didn't work properly, suggesting unpermitted electrical work. I had enough evidence to file code violations that would cost Greg tens of thousands of dollars in fines, back permits, and required modifications. But I wanted to be strategic about it. Greg had started this fight by filing a frivolous complaint about my perfectly legal shed. He'd tried to harass me into submission using city resources. It was time for him to learn what real code enforcement looked like. I started by filing a complaint about the most obvious violation, the unpermitted pool house. I'm calling to report an illegal structure at 1247 Oakwood Drive, I told the code enforcement office. There's an unpermitted accessory building that appears to be used as a rental unit. What makes you think it's unpermitted? The officer asked. I've reviewed the permit records for that address and there's no permit for any accessory structure. The building appears to have electrical and plumbing connections, plus it's being advertised as a short-term rental on Airbnb. We'll send an inspector out within 48 hours. 2 days later, Susan Martinez was back in the neighborhood, this time measuring Greg's property instead of mine. I watched from my kitchen window as she documented the pool house, took photos of the electrical connections, and measured setbacks from the property line. Greg came out to talk to her, gesturing animatedly and pointing toward my house. I couldn't hear the conversation, but his body language suggested he was not happy. That evening, Greg knocked on my door. You called the city on me, he said accusingly. I reported code violations I observed, I replied calmly. Just being a concerned citizen, making sure my neighborhood maintains proper standards. Greg's face turned red as he recognized his own words being thrown back at him. This is harassment. No, Greg. Filing a false complaint about my legal shed was harassment. Reporting your actual code violations is civic duty. Over the next month, the city's investigation into Greg's property expanded significantly. The initial inspection confirmed multiple violations. Unpermitted pool house, 150 square feet accessory structure. Electrical connections without permits, plumbing connections without permits, setback violations, 3 feet instead of required 5 feet. Illegal short-term rental operation. But when the inspector started looking more closely, they found additional problems. The deck extension exceeded permitted size by 108%. The hot tub installation violated electrical codes. The outdoor kitchen had unpermitted gas connections. The property was operating 4 parking spaces in an area approved for 2. Greg received violation notices requiring him to apply for after-the-fact permits for all unpermitted construction, $8,500 in permit fees. Bring all structures into code compliance, $12,000 estimated cost. Cease short-term rental operations immediately. Pay penalties for operating without proper licenses, $2,400. Remove or relocate structures that couldn't be brought into compliance, $15,000 estimated cost. The total estimated cost to resolve all violations, $38,000. But there were additional consequences. The city's investigation triggered other agencies. Tax assessor review. Greg's property would be reassessed to reflect the commercial improvements and rental income. Estimated additional annual taxes, $3,200. Fire marshal inspection, required for any rental operation. Greg's pool house failed fire safety requirements, requiring sprinkler system installation, $6,500. Health department review. Short-term rentals require health inspections. Greg's unit failed due to inadequate ventilation and septic capacity issues. $4,800 to resolve. Total cost of Greg's code violations, $47,300. All because he wanted to harass me over street parking and filed a false complaint about my perfectly legal shed. 2 months after the investigation began, Greg appeared at my door looking defeated. "Steve, we need to talk," he said quietly. "What's on your mind, Greg?" "Look, I know this whole thing got out of hand. The city is saying I owe almost $50,000 in fines and required improvements. That's unfortunate. Karen is talking about leaving me. She says I've destroyed our finances over a stupid neighbor dispute." I waited for him to continue. "The thing is, I can't afford to fix all these violations. The bank is already asking questions about the rental income I didn't report on my mortgage application." That was an interesting detail I hadn't considered. If Greg had been operating a rental business without informing his mortgage lender, he might be in violation of his loan terms as well. "What do you want from me, Greg?" "I want to know if there's a way to make this stop. Maybe we could work something out." "What kind of arrangement did you have in mind?" Greg shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe if I apologized for the complaint about your shed and promised to stop bothering you about parking, you could, I don't know, talk to the city about reducing the fines." I almost laughed. Greg still didn't understand that I wasn't controlling the city's enforcement actions. I had simply reported violations that actually existed, unlike his frivolous complaint about my legal shed. "Greg, I don't control the code enforcement office. They found real violations because you actually violated real codes. I can't make those violations disappear. But you could tell them it was a mistake, that you misunderstood what you saw. That would be lying to city officials, which is illegal. Plus, they have their own evidence now, photos, measurements, permit records. My original complaint is irrelevant at this point." Greg looked desperate. "Then what am I supposed to do?" "The same thing anyone does when they have code violations. Comply with the law." Greg tried several strategies to avoid dealing with his violations. Strategy #1. Ignore the citations. This resulted in additional penalties and a lien being placed against his property. Strategy #2. Hire a lawyer to challenge the violations. The lawyer took $5,000 of Greg's money and then advised him that the violations were legitimate and couldn't be successfully challenged. Strategy #3. Blame me for entrapment. Greg filed a complaint with the city claiming I had somehow tricked him into violating codes. The complaint was dismissed as frivolous. Strategy #4. Try to sell the house. Greg listed his house for sale, but the title company discovered the code violations and liens during the inspection process. No buyer would close on a property with $47,000 in outstanding violations. Finally, Greg accepted reality and started working with the city to resolve the violations. He demolished the illegal pool house, $3,500. He applied for after-the-fact permits for the deck extension, $4,200. He brought the electrical and plumbing into code compliance, $8,800. He paid all outstanding fines and penalties, $12,400. He applied for proper tax assessment on his improvements, additional $3,200 annually. Total cost to Greg, $32,100 in immediate expenses plus ongoing increased taxes. The Airbnb rental operation was permanently shut down, costing Greg approximately $2,000 per month in lost income. 6 months after Greg's frivolous complaint about my shed, he and Karen put their house up for sale again, this time with all violations resolved. They sold at a loss, unable to recoup the costs of the required modifications and having to disclose the history of code violations to potential buyers. Before they moved out, Greg stopped by one last time. "Steve, I owe you an apology," he said. "I was being petty and stupid about the parking thing, and I should never have called the city about your shed." "I appreciate that, Greg. I learned something important from all this." "What's that?" "If you're going to live in glass houses, you shouldn't throw stones, especially at someone who knows how to identify glass house violations." Greg and Karen moved to a suburb north of Austin where they rent a house and presumably follow all local codes and regulations. The new neighbors who bought Greg's house are a young couple with a baby. They're quiet, friendly, and have never once complained about where my clients park. Sometimes justice isn't about revenge, it's about accountability. Greg didn't get in trouble because I was vindictive. He got in trouble because he was systematically violating laws that exist to protect neighborhoods and ensure fair taxation. My name is Steve Morrison, and I'm the city planning consultant who turned a neighbor's harassment into a $47,000 education about municipal codes. When Greg tried to use the city to bully me with false complaints, he learned that some people know how to use the system properly. The irony is that Greg's shed complaint actually did me a favor. It brought Susan Martinez to the neighborhood, where she got to see both properties and understand the difference between frivolous complaints and legitimate violations. Sometimes the best defense against petty harassment is simply knowing the rules better than the person trying to harass you. And sometimes karma comes with a city inspector's badge and a measuring tape. Steve's story illustrates how knowledge of local regulations can be the best defense against harassment by neighbors who misuse municipal systems. By understanding codes and regulations professionally, Steve was able to distinguish between legitimate violations and frivolous complaints. When Greg tried to weaponize code enforcement against him, he discovered that the weapon could be turned around, especially when there were actual violations to be found.